This climate issue, let's go ahead and get into that, because now what they are saying, which is kind of what I predicted, was that this bill is going to hurt or impact a certain group of people more so than others. Who is that group? Let's get into that. Now, this is from NPR. The spending bill will cut emissions, but marginalized groups feel they were sold out. And this is what I was trying to warn people about. I knew that this was coming. So here's a picture here. Let's get into it. The Inflation Reduction Act signed into law Tuesday by President Biden includes more than $360 billion to address climate change. That's the largest single investment ever made to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, something the White House and major environmental groups are touting as a huge win for humanity. However, and this is what I was trying to warn people about, not everyone will feel the benefits of the new bill equally. Analysts and advocates are warning this. People living in neighborhoods that are already dealing with a lot of pollution fear they will face more harm and climate risk, not less. And that could deepen existing environmental inequalities and lock in decades of unnecessary illness and suffering from people who are already marginalized. And I want to give you guys an example of this here in Boston. If you were to go to, there's a intersection per se of the Roxbury neighborhood and the South End where they kind of meet. Part of the South End has now become a wealthy area. And then there's another part that is not, that is more lower income. The wealthy area is obviously the part that has been gentrified. That part, that tip actually touches the Roxbury neighborhood. Did you know that if you're standing on the side of the street that is Roxbury and you walk across the street to the South End, your life expectancy goes up 30 years? Not an exaggeration. A lot of that has to do with environmental issues, having access to clean, safe water, pollution. A lot of differences go into that. So to echo what they are saying here, if you are already living in a community that is already experiencing pollution and people are receiving illness because of the pollution, because of the environmental issues, this bill is actually not going to help you. In fact, it may actually hurt you. And I really want more people to talk about this. There are some parts of the law that are good, and there are some parts that are really bad. Now, that's coming from Minjin Cha, a professor at Occidental College. And the parts that are really bad are pretty significant. Now, listen to this. The law includes hundreds of billions of dollars to tackle global warming by building more solar and wind power, making buildings more efficient, more energy efficient, and helping people buy electric vehicles. Now, I'm going to pause there for just a second and tell you something about these electric vehicles. Two problems here. One, not everyone can afford to purchase an electric vehicle. I actually have looked up pricing for EVs a couple years ago. I can't afford an electric vehicle. Now, I know that they're going to make more that are supposed to be affordable, but I really can't afford to buy a new car. My car that I have, it's used and it's paid for. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing about electric vehicles, let's say that you are able to afford to buy an electric vehicle. Well, there's other expenses that come along with that. There's other things that you have to worry about as well. Where are you going to charge your car? Are there charging stations near where you live? So there's other things that go into that. And I'm not here to say that electric vehicles are bad, but I think telling people, well, just buy an electric vehicle, I feel like that's just a Band-Aid on a much larger issue. So I don't feel like that is going to save this. Analysts estimate it will help the United States reduce planet warming emissions by about 40% compared to 2005 levels by the end of the decade, which is a big step toward a truly low carbon economy. But here we go. That's the part about Joe Manchin, this part here. It subsidizes the building of new pipelines, guarantees new leasing of oil and gas drilling. And this is the portion I was telling people about. It incentivizes investment in still nascent carbon capture technology, which would allow existing heavy polluting fossil fuel facilities to operate longer. Those fossil fuel investments led dozens of grassroots environmental organizations to reject the bill. And this here should have actually been a warning sign to anyone in Congress that was making excuses for this and that supported this bill. Anytime you had the environmental organizations, you had those groups speaking out against it. Well, I think you probably should have listened to what they had to say. I would have liked to have seen them invited to speak on the House floor to these politicians to let them know this is why this portion of the bill does not go far enough and will actually harm people in the end. Let's go on. Now, it goes on to say those organizations rejected the bill, arguing that the harms to communities near fossil fuel sites would outweigh the climate benefits. That's especially true for poor people, indigenous people, and Black people who are already more likely to live with more pollution and less access to clean energy. And when we're finished with this article, I'm actually going to show you where most African Americans live in the United States, and then you'll see what I'm talking about. Let's go on. We are sitting right now with a lot of contradictions. While the bill does designate some funding for disadvantaged communities, it also subsidizing fossil fuels. And this is coming from Wan Jong Chung. He's the climate director at the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. It feels like what the bill is giving with one hand, it's taking with the other. It's basically a wash, if you think about it. For example, Jong Chung says the new law could pay for air monitoring in Southwest Detroit, where he lives and where industrial air pollution makes people sick. See, again, this is another example of the environment making people sick. Not necessarily what they're eating, not necessarily their jobs per se, the kind of job that they have, but the environment. How do you change that? Now it goes on to say, but at the same time, the law invests in fossil fuel industry, which could help those industrial facilities operate for decades to come. See what it's really about? It feels like we're being sacrificed, like we're being left behind. It doesn't feel good that this is the best we can get. In reference to the comment, it feels like we're being sacrificed. I just want to go ahead and say this. Would this have passed if it would have impacted people who live in, I don't know, Beverly Hills? Probably not. Would this bill have passed if it would have impacted people who live in wealthy areas? No. And I'll tell you why. We've talked about it before on the show, that when it comes to policies per se, poor people and middle income people often have no say in policy change. Now, that was a study out of Princeton University that comes from Professor Gillens. Everyone check that out online if you have not read that. So again, like I said, this hurts people who are Black, people who are poor, people who are indigenous. And a lot of times, for some people, if you're indigenous and Black, a lot of times you're all three. You fall into all three of those categories. The Biden administration disputes the idea that the law doesn't do enough for marginalized communities. This is a direct investment in helping clean up communities that have been left out and left behind. Okay, that's coming from Ali. He's the Deputy National Climate Advisor to President Biden. So again, he is the climate advisor to Biden. So of course, he's going to be for the bill. He's going to push it. He's going to say that it's actually a win and not a loss. You have to understand where the talking points are coming from so you'll understand why they're taking the position that they take. The White House estimates that the law includes over $60 billion in spending on so-called environmental justice. That includes money to reduce emissions around the U.S. ports, plant trees in city neighborhoods that are hotter because of past racist housing policies, make electric vehicles more affordable, and install solar panels and make buildings more efficient in low-income neighborhoods. And I'm going to say this again in reference to electric vehicles. Even when they do make them more affordable, guys, I know people that can't afford to buy a $10,000 car. Are they going to make electric vehicles less than $10,000? Some people have to take public transportation. They can't buy a car. So this is the problem. This section here where it says make buildings more efficient in low-income neighborhoods, shouldn't that have been the case to begin with? But it's not, because I've been to public housing projects here in Boston, and I can tell you those buildings are not efficient at all. You see how they treat poor people? Let's go back in. This portion right here, this bill is the product of a compromise. Now, this is coming from Sabby. He says, without compromise, there would be no bill. But the compromise was to basically make it so that poor people, Black people, Indigenous people would have to suffer more. That was the compromise. The compromise was to make it so that let's go ahead and pass this bill. And here's the compromise. Some poor people, some Black people may get sick and die. That's the compromise that they were willing to make for this bill. They can easily throw poor people away. They can easily throw Black people away. Again, you would not see this happen in Beverly Hills. You just wouldn't. Let's go on. The rhetoric is frustrating for those who feel like they are on the losing end of the compromise. I think it's really hurtful for people who live where you have a lot of poverty, where you have a lot of dirty energy. That's coming from Kendall Dix. He's the National Policy Director for Taproot Earth, a climate justice organization based in Louisiana. He fears the new law will lead to more pollution along the Gulf Coast, where petrochemical facilities are concentrated and air pollution already causes widespread illness and premature death. And he's right. And again, I'm going to show you in a second where most Black people live in the United States, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Are we going to be fine with some communities being written off? And which communities? And I'll go ahead and answer that question. Yes, they will be fine with that. This is just another example, which I've shown you guys multiple times, that they don't really care about poor people. They don't really care about Black people. When they want to compromise, they're willing to compromise on those groups. They're not willing to compromise on rich people. They're not. Now, where do most Black people live in the United States? I want to show you this map. Now, this to me is not really a surprise, having lived in different parts of the U.S. Tried to zoom in here for just a little bit. Actually, if I can get rid of that. Okay, that's better. Yeah, let's get into it. This is a map of the United States, and I want to show you where the demographics are. Purple is the largest amount. And then as the colors start to lighten, less and less African Americans. As you can imagine, most African Americans live where? Mostly on the East Coast, right? So we want to start with, if I can zoom out just a little bit. Oh, let me do it this way. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, that's actually a better view. If we start with the Northeast, this really light blue color, not as many African Americans. But as you start to go further south, as you could predict, once you get here into this mid-Atlantic region where you have Philadelphia, New York City, DC, this is where now you are getting into the states that have larger populations of African Americans, but particularly in the South. And I want to point to a certain region in the South. Now you see the Southeast here. We have North Carolina, South Carolina. Once you hit Georgia, that's when it really starts to sink in, right? So you have Georgia, we have Mississippi. I hope I'm doing these in order. I'm sorry, you guys. Mississippi, Louisiana. Louisiana's here. You have Arkansas. Look at this part right here. This is the portion he was talking about in reference to Louisiana. He said there will be a lot more drilling here, right here along the Gulf Coast. So yes, it would affect Black communities. If you notice, if we look at the map even more, Texas, that's a medium shade purple. Yeah, still a good amount of African Americans there. But as you pull away from the South, and particularly the Southeast, pulling into the Southwest, you see less and less African Americans. Going even over to California, and we have Los Angeles here, less African Americans. It gets to decrease more as you go further to the Northwest. And once you get to this portion of the United States, which I guess some people refer to this as the heartland right here, where you have Montana, you have North Dakota, South Dakota, Colorado, Nebraska, Oklahoma, less and less African Americans. And you do not see that population pick back up again until you get over here towards St. Louis. And then it picks up more when you hit Chicago and, of course, Detroit. Most of African Americans in the United States live near water. Chicago, water. Detroit, water. St. Louis is an exception. But most of us live on the coast. We live near a body of water. And this is what I've been trying to tell everyone. Climate change is going to affect who the most? Black people. This is something that Bernie Sanders, I think he was trying to say this during the Democrat primary debates, didn't get it out in time. And the moderator was kind of pushing him. And she was like, we're talking about race. We're not talking about climate change. But I knew that's where he was trying to head towards, is that, yes, climate change is going to impact Black people more, because look at where we live. You see what I mean? Now, there are reasons why we live where we live. Obviously, there's more Black people in the South because of slavery, right? Obviously, you're going to have more Black populations in places like Chicago and Detroit because of the Great Migration. When Black people move from the South to the cities that had a lot of factory jobs, that's why you have more Black people there. Same thing when you go to places like DC, Philadelphia. Boston is not going to have as many, because Boston was not one of the cities that benefited from the Great Migration. Boston was not one of the cities that was a factory city per se. That's not to say we didn't have factories here, but nothing compared to Chicago, Detroit, nothing compared to that. Even Baltimore used to have a lot of factories. So when it comes to climate change, when people tell you that we should not worry about it, that African Americans should not worry about climate change, that is not true. You should worry about it. When the sea level begins to rise, we will be the ones who are most affected, because this is where we live. People in the Midwest, they may still have to deal with aspects of climate change. They may still have to deal with droughts, issues like that. But pay attention to this map. This is where we're at. This is where we're at. So yes, it will hit us harder. And yes, if they could continue to do drilling on the Gulf Coast here, Louisiana, this area right here, yes, you will be impacted. And something I'd like to point back to when we think about Louisiana, Hurricane Katrina, who was mostly affected? It was Black people in Louisiana. So let's remember that. So this is why I'm telling you, people cheering on this climate portion of this bill, it's not what you think it is. They're not going to just give us something just because. They're going to give us something as long as there's something else in it for corporations. And that's exactly what they did. They're helping out the fossil fuel companies. So beware of this if you live in those neighborhoods, because if you see that your neighborhoods, people in the neighborhood start to become more sick, people in the neighborhood start to have more issues with asthma. This is part of the reason why African Americans, we have more issues with asthma because of where we live. Just wanted to point that out. Share that with your friends. Share that. Let me go ahead and shout out some of these comments here. Shout out to Jay the Informant. Thank you for this super chat. Stacey Abrams, support that climate bill. SMDH. Yes. But remember, Stacey Abrams has enough money to move away from all this. Remember, she's a millionaire now. Didn't used to be, but she is now. Latif says, well, that's confusing considering everyone arrived on the East Coast. The Traveler says the anti-South talk we see broken down with the demographics. That rhetoric seems more racist, and people don't seem to realize that the South is home to us. That's where most of us come from. Most of us. If not like myself per se, my parents or my grandparents, that's where a lot of us come from, regardless of where we may live now. So something to keep in mind.